Well, hello everybody. Sorry for the slight delay. We were sorting out some technical details. Welcome everyone. My name is Ángel Alonso and I'm the Vice Dean of the School of Global and Public Affairs here at EE University. We're very glad today, as part of the Transatlantic Relations Initiative, to have with us Jon Decker, who is White House Correspondent and Senior Editor at Gray TV. Jon has a very distinguished and long career covering the White House and covering US politics. And today he's going to be sharing with us his insights on the forthcoming midterm elections in the United States. As being a part of the School of Global and Public Affairs, you guys know how important this is for not only for the US itself, but for the global community, because the result of the midterm somehow are going to determine also the ability of the Biden administration to be capable of implementing not only its legislative agenda, but also many aspects and politics that are relevant for international affairs as well. I like to welcome Jon again, because he was here with us. We were talking about that a few minutes ago. He was with us a couple of years ago, ahead of the presidential election. So he already shared with us his insights and his forecasts, which he was reminding us how accurate they were. So we look forward to the same level of accuracy today. Jon, and I would also like to thank AmCham, who are connecting with us online, for making possible that Jon is with us here today. And it's a great partnership and collaboration that we have with them as part of the Transatlantic Relations Initiative. So now I'm going to pass the floor to Waya, who is the real maker and the real force behind the Transatlantic Relations Initiative, so she can introduce Jon. Thank you, Waya.
Thank you so much, Ángel. And thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, AmCham, and thank you, Jon, so much for coming again. We're so pleased to welcome you back, despite of the current circumstances, the pandemic, the time to come. So thank you so much. So just a brief introduction, a little bit more about your career. So as Ángel said, Jon is a White House correspondent and senior national editor for Gray Television. Prior to that, you worked for Fox News Radio, and you also Reuters Television, and also Sirius XM Radio. What else can I say? Well, you've been part of the White House Corps, press corps, since 1995, and in 2015, I think they elected you as a board member of the White House Correspondents Association. Jon is also a professor who teaches at Georgetown University and at UCLA Law School as an adjunct professor. And you've covered the last 5 administrations. And also you actually also cover tennis. I know that tennis is a passion of yours. You were in Madrid last time for the Davis Cup, and you've covered all 4 Grand Slams. I'm sure you've been covering the Djokovic saga and debacle.
Right.
And yeah, you also were a commentator on the Tennis Channel, and I think Jon has reported from many cities, and we're so happy to have you in Madrid again. So thank you, and the floor is yours. We're so pleased to have you.
Thank you so much, Waya, and thank you, Ángel, as well. I also want to give my thanks to AmChamSpain to be back before you. As Ángel mentioned, back in November of 2019 is when I was at IE, different building. This is really impressive, very impressive with what you have here, and I'm sure the students are pretty impressed by your facilities as well. Yes, I could talk for an hour about Novak Djokovic, but today I'm going to talk to you about the midterm elections, and also the first year. We're coming up on the 1-year anniversary of Joe Biden as president. So I thought it would be a good time to talk about that first before we get to the midterms. Talk about why President Biden is in the position that he's in right now, as far as his approval ratings are concerned. And this is about, I would say, 25, 30 minutes. And then I hope you have questions. I want to hear your questions, not only for the people that are here in this room, but for the people that are tuning in online. So why don't we get started here? This indeed is the state of play. And we start off with our year in review of what's happened. And it starts with January the 20th of 2021. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris inaugurated as President and Vice President. By the way, the pictures are pictures I've taken. So looks pretty good. I'm not a professional photographer, but I had a really nice spot to watch the inauguration. And it was a socially distant inauguration. Not very many people were there, of course, because of the pandemic. When Joe Biden was inaugurated as president, his approval rating on day one, 55%. 55%. And the primary reason for that is that independents were essentially wanting to give him the benefit of the doubt. After a very divided 4 years under President Trump, Americans said, okay, let's give this new person an opportunity to see if indeed he's going to fulfill the promises that he made out on the campaign trail. So this is January 20th. We're going to fast forward in time here. Oops.
Go ahead. Yeah.
There we go. This is really fast forward. This fast forwards to mid-June of President Biden's first year in office. What is this? This is the meeting that President Biden had in Geneva with Russian President Vladimir Putin. I was at that summit that took place. And this was a summit in which it was hoped that tensions could be reduced between the US and Russia. After all, over the course of the final years of the Trump administration, the US and Russia had really descended into not such a great place in terms of relations between the two countries. And President Biden proposed a summit, and that's what this was all about. No major breakthroughs, although it was agreed that the US and Russia would increase their contacts diplomatically with each other. And that's obviously a good thing when you have two superpowers actually talking to each other. A few months prior to this meeting, President Biden had a legislative victory. It was in March of 2021. The legislative victory was passage of a $2 trillion COVID relief bill. Not one Republican voted for it. That being said, Americans by and large were pleased with elements contained in this legislation. And so the president kept up in March his approval rating at 53%, to tick down. When this meeting took place, the average of polls had the president's approval rating at 53%. So he's still riding pretty high considering where President Trump was during his 4 years in office. During his 4 years in office, as a reminder, President Trump's approval rating was in the low 40s. So this is a vast improvement over our prior president. Let's jump ahead. This is August 20th of 2021. And this is, I believe, the start of the decline in the president's approval ratings. It was when the president announced in the East Room at the White House, the US is withdrawing all of its interests, diplomats, military from Afghanistan. I was in the East Room when the president made this announcement. I took this with my iPhone, and it was historic, and Americans did not react well to this withdrawal. Not that the US necessarily wanted to be involved in this ongoing war for an extended period of time beyond the 20 years that the US is already involved in Afghanistan. It's just that the withdrawal was so chaotic, and it really did not reflect well on President Biden, who campaigned on this idea of being able to bring some semblance of presidential leadership, foreign policy experience to the White House, to the West Wing. That this is happening on his watch, I think, disappointed many Americans, particularly independent voters. It also disappointed our allies, America's allies, when the US had this precipitous and chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan. And so you see the decline sharply with this particular event. Let's move on. About a month or so later, President gets his third booster shot. I was in the room when he got his third booster shot, and I took this photograph. Now, the reason I have this photograph is not so much whether you care that the president got a third booster shot. The reason is because of the pandemic. How has the president managed this pandemic over the course of his presidency. And if you look at public opinion polls, the vast majority of Americans do not believe that he has managed it well because of sometimes the messages that are delivered, not only from the president, but healthcare advisors to the president, which sometimes differ literally on a daily basis. And so, give you a perfect example, the booster shot. At one point, Americans were told, we will not need booster shots at all. No need for it whatsoever. And lo and behold, a few months later, we're told by the president and his healthcare advisors, everyone who is eligible for a booster shot should get a booster shot. And that is obviously a mixed message, to say the least, and it's reflected in the president's approval ratings. Again, I think that's another reason why we've seen this decline. The president in late October traveled to Italy. He met with the Pope, but he met also with G20 leaders in Rome. And I traveled with the president for this particular trip. Following the trip with the G20 leaders, the president then went on to Scotland for the climate summit. And for both of these events, no great breakthroughs that would give the president any type of boost, noticeable boost in his approval ratings, either at the climate summit. In fact, there may even argue some disappointments there in terms of commitments being made from other world powers like India, for instance, as far as reductions in greenhouse gases over the course of the next few decades. Finally, a victory. The president gets a victory with the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure bill, November the 15th, 2021. Very cold day. It's a little bit of a celebration on the south lawn of the White House. I took this picture as the president signed the legislation, and this was indeed bipartisan. The president's surrounded by a few Republicans, as well as a lot of Democrats, who were so pleased that this $2 trillion infrastructure bill was finally passed. And the feeling at the White House at the time in November of 2021, that this would stop the slide of the decline in the president's approval ratings, that this victory will give momentum to President Biden going forward. And the thinking, as far as the administration is concerned, was wrong, because the momentum that the president had did not last. The president was hoping that with the passage of the infrastructure bill, soon another piece of his legislative agenda, his so-called Build Back Better bill, would also pass Congress. He'd be able to sign that, which would, the White House believed, be a major victory that they could then sell as they move closer to this year and the midterm elections. The Build Back Better bill for now is dead. There's no chance of passage. And the reason being is because it's a 50-50 Senate, and the president right now does not have, I'm gonna take this one off, I have two. The president right now does not have the support of every Democrat in the US Senate. And as a result, he's not going to be able to pass that social spending bill that he campaigned on as president of the United States. So what does the president do going forward in this year? We're now in 2022. Well, let's talk about 2022, the midterm elections. The Senate is divided 50-50. There are 50 Republicans, 50 Democrats. There are two independents, but one caucus is with Republicans, Lisa Murkowski. The other caucus is with Democrats, that's Angus King of Maine. But this year there are 34 seats up for election. 20 of them are held by Republicans, 14 of them are held by Democrats, which means, of course, Republicans have more seats to defend. That being said, let's look at history, what happens in midterm elections. Midterm elections, the party not in power typically gains seats. What is the party not in power? It's the Republican Party. The party in power is the Democrats. They control the White House, the House, the Senate. And let's look at history again. History tells us that the party not in power gains 4 seats in the US Senate. If history holds up in 2022, obviously that would mean that Republicans would regain control of the Senate, which would not be good news for President Biden. Reason being is because it would make it that much more difficult for him to pass his legislative agenda in the next 2 years of this term. So let's see what happens as it relates to the map for 2022. This is the map as I see it right now. You see up at the top a red, a blue, and let's call it a gray line. This is a horizontal line. It shows 48 Democrats, 47 Republicans, 5 races deciding the Senate. That's according to me. That's the way I view it right now. And those 5 states are the states that are in gray: Georgia, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Nevada. In some of those states, we still don't even know who the nominees will be representing their political parties in the midterm elections. Pennsylvania, for instance, we don't know who the nominee is going to be for the Republican or Democratic Party. In Ohio, we don't know who the Republican nominee is going to be. In Georgia, we don't know who the Republican nominee is going to be. In Nevada, we don't know who the Republican nominee is going to be. And in Wisconsin, we don't know who the Democratic nominee is going to be in the midterm elections. And quite frankly, in some of those states, it really depends who the nominee is to determine who's going to win that race. Because as you know, sometimes the nominee that wins in the primary is not necessarily the strongest general election candidate. So a lot depends what happens in the primaries in Georgia, in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, Wisconsin, and Nevada as to whether or not the parties that don't have the nominees in place choose the strongest general election candidate. You look at right now polling in Georgia, in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Nevada, the president who's not on the ticket, but his popularity does impact voter turnout. It's all about energy. All elections, whether you're talking about an American election, whether you're talking about an election here in Europe, all elections are about sort of turning out the base. How do you energize your supporters to go out to the polls? The off-year election that we had last year, I think was evidence that Republicans were more energized than Democrats. And that's one reason why in Virginia, for instance, which has been a blue state for the past few election cycles, voted a Republican to be the governor in the off-year election. Energy counts for a lot. And when you have a president that's not popular in terms of public opinion polls, the energy for the base to go out and vote is decreased substantially. So that is one of those headwinds that Democrats have going into the midterm elections. Let's look at the House. History tells us the party that's not in power, the Republican Party in this case, will gain seats in this midterm election. How many? History tells us 26. If that happens, that would mean that the House would flip and Kevin McCarthy would become Speaker of the House when there is a new Congress sworn in 2023. I don't know if that's going to happen. For sure, no one does. No one knows the future. But history tells us Republicans are in a very good position in terms of winning back the House of Representatives. This essentially is the breakdown right now for the House of Representatives. Democrats have an 8-vote, right? 9-vote, I should say, majority, 222 to 213. If history plays itself out, and we're talking about a 26-seat gain by Republicans in the midterm elections, well, you see what happens. You see how the House would flip and Republicans would regain control of the House of Representatives. Just a reminder about the presidential election. I figure as long as I'm here, some of you may have some questions about something that's going to happen a few years down the road. And I thought I'd touch on that, if you don't mind, before I get to your questions. Presidential election of 2020, you see that President Biden won by 7 million votes. You see the percentage difference between President Biden and former President Trump. And you see the Electoral College vote victory that President Biden had in 2020. There it is, 306 to 232. And what does that mean for 2024? Well, I mean, there's some questions as to whether or not Joe Biden, is not getting any younger, is actually going to be the nominee in 2024. He says if he's healthy, he will be the nominee. He will run again. But if he decides, you know what, one term's enough for me, there's no guarantee necessarily that his vice president, Kamala Harris, would necessarily be the Democratic nominee in 2024. I think there are some other Democrats that would very much like to compete for the nomination. On the Republican side, I am asked so many times, and maybe you were going to ask me this question, so let me beat you to it. Is Donald Trump going to run for president in 2024? Well, as you know, he hints at that he's going to run pretty much every time he has a campaign rally, every time he does a campaign interview, every time he's on Fox News, that he's going to run again in 2024. I am in the minority. I do not believe he's going to run for president once again in 2024. And I'm asked why, and I'll give you my reason. The loss that he suffered in 2020 really hit him hard. Whether you know the president or not, as an outsider looking at him from afar, he's got a big ego. And that loss really devastated him. Former President Trump is all about winning, being a winner, getting victories. And what happened in 2020? He lost. He was a loser. And that hurt him to his core. And I'm getting inside his head here for a little bit. But first time I've interviewed him was back in 1999. And I interviewed him while president as well. He does not want to be a two-time loser. And the prospect of the possibility of being a two-time loser, in all honesty, I think is going to not prevent him, but make him think twice about running for election in 2024. I'm in the minority. I could be wrong. If you listen to him, then I'm definitely wrong. But he will make a decision after the midterm elections in terms of what he decides to do as it relates to 2024. There are plenty of Republicans that are waiting in the wings to run for the Republican nomination. They believe that whoever the Republican nominee is has a better than even shot of being the next president of the United States. Some of the people who are contemplating running for the Republican nomination, running for president, include the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, the former UN ambassador, Nikki Haley, former vice president, Mike Pence, the former secretary of state, Mike Pompeo, the current senator from Texas, Ted Cruz, and there are others. It's going to be a crowded race for the Republican nomination in 2024. I've spoken for about a half hour or so, and I want to leave it at that. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them. So thank you very much.
Questions, please, in the room and also online, you can, unmute your mic and jump in. Please feel free to ask John some questions. This is your chance. I'm sure you have some questions about 2024.
Can I just ask a question on the very last thing you said?
Sure.
If Trump does decide to stand,
Yes.
Does anyone stand a chance of competing against the
If,
list that you gave or anyone else?
yeah, so it's a great question. If he decides that he's running for the Republican nomination, it's his for the taking. There's no one that can compete with him. There's no one that has built the infrastructure like he has, no one that has the energy, no one that has the support of the Republican Party base like Donald Trump. So he's got a difficult decision to make because he knows he's going to be the nominee. But the question is, can I win the general election, not just the nomination? Can I win the general election? And we saw in 2020 that the election boils down to a number of key states, and Trump lost those key states in 2020. Has the dynamic changed in those states that would allow him to flip them back and put him on the road to winning enough electoral votes to be the president? That's what he's got to figure out. But it's a risk. It's a risk to what he views as his legacy. It's how he's viewed in history. He's already been the first president to be impeached twice. He doesn't want to be a president who loses twice as well. So hopefully that answers your question. Yes.
I have a question about the relationship with Russia and how dangerous you think that it's evolving right now.
Yeah, it is a dangerous situation when you're talking about tensions that exist between superpowers. As you know, since that summit, the president and President Putin have spoken a number of times by video link, by video conference, and there seems to be a stalemate in terms of what comes next, in the sense that Putin has amassed thousands, tens of thousands of troops along the Russian border with Ukraine. The US and our allies, our European allies, our NATO allies, have said, look, we're not going to make any promises that you want us to make about not permitting in the future Ukraine to be a part of NATO. And so what happens next? It's anyone's guess what happens next. Can Putin sort of reduce the number of troops at the Russian-Ukraine border without it looking like he's lost? That's a difficult thing, you know, for someone like Putin to do that. I think for the foreseeable future, those tens of thousands of troops amassed at the border will remain there. The conversations continue. The US National Security Advisor in particular believes that Russia is on the verge of entering into Ukraine illegally. And that wouldn't be good, obviously, for you know, so many actors involved in that. So the talks, fortunately, the sides are talking. We just had a meeting that took place last week between Wendy Sherman, who's the Deputy US Secretary of State, and her counterpart from Russia. And I would imagine meetings like that, which took place in Geneva last week, will continue.
How likely would it be that, you know, the US would give military support to Ukraine? Would they actually enter, or what kind of support are they going to give? Is it just going to be training, or is it actually going to be weapons?
Yeah, why?
What kind of involvement?
Yeah,
would
it's
it
a
be?
great question. So the hawks in the Republican Party for many years have urged the US to supply to Ukraine offensive military weapons. And I think that the safe bet for the Biden administration is simply providing defensive military weaponry to Ukraine. Would there possibly be any US military involvement in terms of troop presence on the ground in Ukraine? Highly doubtful. It's highly doubtful. Boy, this president is dealing with a number of things right now, which are so difficult in terms of domestic policy, but this is a major foreign policy challenge that he faces. The foreign policy challenge that he also faces in China also is not going away. And it seems like the top foreign policy challenge that existed during the Obama and Trump years, which is North Korea, has sort of receded when you think about it. We don't hear that much about North Korea except for when they launch, some sort of missile across its neighbors. But aside from that, Russia and China have really been the two foreign policy challenges that President Biden has devoted much of his time to.
Good morning, John. This is Aida Kasami-Chana. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, hi.
Hi, good morning, John. It's such a great pleasure to have you in Spain again. I'm so sorry that I couldn't be there in presence, but thank you so much for coming to speak to all of us again. John is a longtime friend from AmChamSpain, and as Angel Alonso explained before, we've hosted him together with IE in other occasions. And it's very nice to have you here again. So sort of like explaining how the midterm elections, how you perceive them. From my previous experiences with your predictions have been amazingly how you have always predicted the results beforehand. So we'll be paying a lot of attention to the outcome of the midterm elections and see whether the Republicans gain the Senate again. And I had a very quick question. It's very interesting to see what you think about the Trump running for president again. But what do you think about his daughter, Ivanka? Do you think she is she thinking about considering running for the elections at some point?
That's a really great question, Aida. It's often thought that the reason why Ivanka Trump and her husband, Jared Kushner, moved to Florida was not just because of the tax advantages that Florida has, no state income tax, but also because if she wants to lay a political future, Florida is a great place to do it. And so right now, in the immediate future, she is not running for anything. She's not running for governor. She's not running for the Senate. But that's not to say that down the road she won't. And would I be surprised if she ran for public office? I would not. Would it shock me if she ran for the US Senate in a few years? No, I wouldn't. So keep your eye on her. I don't think that Donald Trump Jr., another child of former President Trump, who's often been mentioned as possibly pursuing a career in politics, I don't think that he's as interested, quite frankly, in politics. Ivanka's a different story. I think that she's very much interested in pursuing a career in politics and public service. And I think that within 5 years, I could see that happening for sure.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, John.
You're welcome.
If the Republicans take back the Senate, what could President Biden do in the next 2 years of his term in office to try and push through bills? Because obviously it will be a lot more difficult for him to do that. Yeah,
you see how difficult it is, even with a 50-50 Senate in which Democrats actually control the Senate. It's difficult because if you're President Biden, you need every Democrat on board what it is that you're trying to pass. And we saw this wasn't successful in terms of a variety of things, whether you're talking about voting rights legislation, whether you're talking about climate legislation, whether you're talking about this Build Back Better social spending legislation. Simply having a majority, again, it's a majority, which is 50-50 plus one, the vice president breaking the tie, is not enough. And so if the Senate flips and you have Republicans controlling the Senate with Mitch McConnell as the majority leader, quite frankly, his legislative agenda for the final 2 years of his first term, again, I don't know if it'll be a second, but of his term, will really be stalled. I just don't see the kind of cooperation in the divided nature of government that we see right now that would allow President Biden to pass legislation that is big and bold. Big and bold, by my definition, is a $2 trillion infrastructure bill. That's big and bold, and he managed to get bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate. But I don't see many other instances where you could have Republicans joining with Democrats on big items in the final 2 years of President Biden's term.
John,
Yes.
just related to this,
Yes.
let's look at it from the other point of view and the counterfactual. If there is a good result for the Democrats, and
Yes.
they retain the Senate, could we see actually an improvement in the position of President Biden to push forward his legislative agenda? And some of the senators, like Senator Manchin, etc.,
Yeah.
sort of feeling the pressure that now they have to be more supportive for the president's agenda if he gets a good result in the midterms?
Yeah, so I like talking about counterfactuals, and it's a very good question. People pay a lot of attention to Joe Manchin because he has so much power in this formulated Senate 50-50. The thing that people sometimes don't understand about Joe Manchin is the state where he's from. He's from the most conservative state in the country. He is from the most pro-Trump state in the country. And what I mean by that is West Virginia had the largest margin of victory for Donald Trump in both 2016 and 2020. In 2016, Donald Trump won West Virginia by 42 points. And he won West Virginia in 2020 by 39 points. And so when you're trying to convince Joe Manchin to go along with a legislative item, you have to remember the constituents that he represents. The constituents that he represents are constituents who may be registered Democrats, but they are conservative. And Joe Manchin, if he's interested in his future political career, doesn't need to pay as much attention to what is happening at the national level, but what's happening in his own state. And that's the reason why he is so difficult to flip in terms of getting support for items in the president's agenda, and the reason why he's really held firm in his positions that he's had so far in these first 2 years, or not this first year that President Biden has had in office. So now let me get to your question. What happens though if Democrats actually add to their numbers? Well, that means that Joe Manchin's power goes away. It's no longer 50-50. He's just another senator. He can be a no vote, but his no vote isn't going to make a difference if you gain a few seats in the Senate. And we didn't get to the Senate in terms of my forecast. I think what we're talking about here is, even though I had 5 states being states that could determine who controls the Senate, I think it might actually come down to 2, Ohio and Pennsylvania. And the reason why I find it difficult to make an actual prediction is because we don't know who the nominees are in those 2 states. And that really, sort of determines everything in terms of making a prediction there. But if the president were to gain seats in the Senate, I think it also depends, to answer your question on how, what does the president pursue? Does he pursue an agenda which is really supported by progressives in the Democratic Party, or does he move to the center and position himself for the midterm elections? Because if he moves himself to the center to position himself for the midterm elections, he put himself in a pretty good spot. Think about Bill Clinton when he was running for re-election in 1996. He moved to the center. He passed welfare reform against the wishes of many progressives in his party. That was supported by Republicans. So he moved to the center and he easily won re-election. So don't write off Joe Biden just yet. I mean, I don't think you can write off any politician really. Things can change. When I last give you an idea about how things can change, when I last spoke here at IE in November of 2019, and I made a forecast about the presidential election, I made that forecast before any of us have heard the word COVID, right? A lot can change in a short period of time. So please keep that in mind. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you regarding the pending lawsuits of the January 6 riots and how that would affect not only the midterms, but the next following elections, especially with the Republican Party and how separated the political atmosphere happened to be the past year.
Yeah, that's a really good question. You know, I didn't talk about that in my timeline, what happened on January 6th, which of course preceded by a few weeks the inauguration of Joe Biden, but it's certainly in the news, and I'm glad you asked the question. The January 6th Select Committee continues its work. It is a committee that is duly appointed, despite what some Republicans said. It's duly appointed by the Speaker of the House. It's bipartisan. It has 2 Republicans on the committee. They continue their work, and they say their work will continue through at least the middle of this year. They may make recommendations to the Justice Department, referrals as they call them, in terms of indictments of individuals who may be very close to President Trump, perhaps even President Trump. We don't know. We'll see where the work goes. There is a significant percentage of Americans that is paying close attention to the work of the committee. There's also a significant percentage of Americans that is tired of returning to what happened on January 6th. And so it really is up to those Americans who have no opinion and could be swayed one way or the other in terms of what impact that would have on the midterm elections. I honestly don't know, because I don't know where their work is ultimately going to proceed. But you know, as things stand right now, I would not be comfortable if I was Congressman Jim Jordan, if I was former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, if I was Steve Bannon, who actually is going to go to trial for defying a congressional subpoena. The worst legal advice I can ever think of, and I say that speaking as a lawyer, just to defy a congressional subpoena. I don't know what his thinking is there, but it seems like a slam dunk for the prosecution against Steve Bannon. So it's a great question, but there are so many unknowns in terms of what the committee decides to do over the next few weeks. I will make a prediction, however. The Supreme Court will ultimately make a determination as to whether or not a former president can invoke executive privilege, whether former President Trump can invoke executive privilege over documents that are at the National Archives. I think the Supreme Court, which is conservative, is going to rule against former President Trump, and that material will be handed over to the Select Committee. And the belief is that some of that material that's handed over to the Select Committee is, at the very least, not going to put the former president, Donald Trump, in a very good light. He's already not in a very good light, but I think it worsens things for him with this material that I believe will ultimately be handed over to the Select Committee. But that's an excellent question.
I have another question.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about, potential Democratic contenders for 2024?
Sure.
So you were saying that it's not obvious that Kamala Harris will be running. So other than Biden, should he run, who do you think has a chance? And should Trump be the nominee? What do you think? Who could Trump beat, and who could beat Trump among the Democratic potentials?
That's playing a lot of things out there. So let's go.
I know a lot of, you got the crystal ball.
Yeah. So it's a great question. So let's go down that route of hypotheticals. Joe Biden decides he's not running for another term. Kamala Harris, who's vice president, would certainly believe that she is the likely successor, should be the standard bearer, but no one hands anything to anybody in politics. You have to work for it. And it's often thought that a member of the president's cabinet, Pete Buttigieg, who's Secretary of Transportation, he's certainly ambitious. He ran for president before, after all, he is ambitious, would certainly compete for that nomination. A name that I mentioned often when I'm asked that question, Wyatt, is a name that surprises some people, but I don't know why it should surprise them. And that's Gavin Newsom of California. He just got through a challenge to his leadership of California through a recall election. And I think that actually emboldened him. He is something that both parties lack, which is someone who exhibits youth and energy. And when you're talking about former President Trump, who's in his mid-70s, and Joe Biden, who's 78, I think people want to see, sort of new blood out there. And he's from the largest state in the country, California. And he's ambitious. You put all that together, to me, I think that he certainly would consider a run for the Democratic nomination in 2024. And it depends how you run. I mean, what Joe Biden was able to do when he ran in 2020 was essentially tell progressives, look, I'm going to make some promises out there, but you have to give me a long leash because I have to win the election. You can hold me to certain things once I win, but just give me a long leash so I can run. And I think that whoever runs for the Democratic Party in 2024 has to have that same promise from the electorate. The key to getting things done is first winning. And, if you run as a far left candidate for president, as Walter Mondale found out, as Mike Dukakis found out, you don't do so well in the general election. You have to run in the center, which is what Bill Clinton did, and what Barack Obama did as well in 2008 when he ran for the first time for president. So will it be as competitive as on the Republican side? I don't think so. It's going to be fewer names out there running for president, but ambition crosses party lines. There are very ambitious Republicans and there are very ambitious Democrats. And so if Joe Biden is not the nominee in 2024, decides he doesn't want to run for another term, there will be a handful of Democrats that will certainly compete for the nomination.
And should it be Biden-Trump rerun?
Yeah, well,
What do you think?
It's funny. I'm at the White House every day, and at the press briefings every day. I speak to people in the administration every day. And we went through what the election showed in terms of results. And one thing that this presentation did not show you is why. Yes, President Biden won by 7 million votes. He had 306 electoral votes, and I don't have the reasons why in this presentation. That is another presentation I could give. But there seems to be a lack of awareness, from my opinion, that the reason that Joe Biden won wasn't because of this great groundswell of energy and support that we saw for, let's say, Barack Obama in 2008. The reason why Joe Biden won is because he wasn't Donald Trump. Most people, sorry, hard to quantify that, right? But a significant percentage of the American public that voted for Joe Biden did so because they were voting against Donald Trump. And if there's a realization of that, an acknowledgement of that, I think it helps you if you're a politician. Just figure out, why did I win? And so you asked me the question, what happens if it's Trump versus Biden 2.0? And I think that same antipathy that Americans felt towards Donald Trump as a whole in 2020, it hasn't gone away. And to get to your question, it may be elevated because of the January 6th commission and things that we may learn from that select committee. So having said all of that, in terms of my answer to you, Waya, I think that if it is a rematch, it's one of the reasons why, getting back to my point about why Donald Trump would be hesitant to run for another term. I think the dynamic is still there that more Americans than not, even ones who may be disappointed in some of the things that they've seen in this first year of President Biden, even those Americans would say, yeah, I'm not really happy with President Biden in terms of what he's done in his first year. He's governed as a progressive, but I just can't vote for Donald Trump. And so I think that that is your answer, why a rematch doesn't necessarily turn out differently for Donald Trump in 2024. Yeah. Yeah.
And so if we have someone on Zoom that.
Oh, okay. Someone on Zoom?
There's a, yeah, Keelong one. You have your hand up? Keelong one. Can you hear us? Keelong?
Elon, go right ahead if you can. Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me? Professor, can you hear me?
Yes.
I thank you for your presentation and Qilong one. And I have two questions about the election. The first one is that do you think that will Mike Pompeo participate in the next presidential election? And the second question is that usually the poll result before the election is different from the real result after election. How do you think of this phenomenon? Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. So let's talk about Mike Pompeo first. Mike Pompeo is very ambitious. Mike Pompeo, to his credit, this doesn't get into politics at all. He's lost a significant amount of weight. Good for him, right? It's not easy to do. So there's thought that he's lost so much weight because he's preparing to run for president in 2024. He's got a great background in terms of his CV on paper. Congressman, head of the CIA, Secretary of State, served in the military, West Point grad, on paper, looks pretty good. The other thing I think he has going for him is how he hopes to appeal if he runs for the Republican nomination in 2024. And that's to a very important constituency in the Republican Party, and that is Evangelical Christians. It's a very important constituency, particularly in the early state of Iowa that votes. I think that he and Mike Pence will be competing for that demographic group. And, I think that those two compete for that demographic group, and one or the other knocks each other out. But I have no doubt that he will run for the Republican nomination in 2024. A lot of the question is who decides they're going to actually step out there, declare they're going to run before President Trump declares he's not going to run. He is the leader. He is still the leader of the Republican Party. And you don't want to cross the leader of the Republican Party if you're a Republican and you're ambitious and you want to run for president. So to a certain extent, Donald Trump has frozen the field. He's frozen the Republican field from, declaring that they're going to run for the Republican nomination in 2024. Your other question had to do with polling before elections and what we learn after the election. Yeah, look, I've noticed this the past few election cycles. There are some good polls, there are some bad polls. It's difficult to, determine why that is. I talk to pollsters, that's part of my job. I talk to pollsters and I ask them a very similar question that you asked me is, how did you get it so wrong? How were you so off in terms of your forecast? And they come up with reasons that, let them live another day. But that being said, polls are difficult to trust sometimes. And again, it has to do with turnout. It has to do with people being honest with pollsters. That's a big part of it. It depends how the poll is conducted. If it's a poll in which it's just done online, that's not going to be very accurate. It's just the people that sort of reply to an online poll. Whereas if it's done where you're randomly selecting people and weighting it, Republican, Democrat, Independent, there are people that do this for a living that are very good at it. And there are good pollsters and bad pollsters, like there are, good professionals in just every profession, good people and bad people. So we will still pay quite a lot of attention to polls. I do. It just gives you a sense about where the mood of the electorate is more than anything else. And so polls gave us a good indication about the election in Virginia ahead of the Virginia governor's race. And you knew it was going to be awfully close, and it was. And we also saw polls in the waning days of that particular governor's race, which seemed to indicate the Republican had the advantage in that particular race. But excellent question.
Thank you, Professor.
You're welcome.
Any more questions?
Just
Yes.
one, in terms of the kind of pending hanging states talked about, what do you think is between now and then? So I guess the number one that you said is that we need to figure out who the candidates are. That's
Yeah.
kind of going to be the
Right.
main driver. But other than that, what do you see as the drivers of where those end up? I mean, is it, classically, are we over the pandemic? Is the pandemic likely to work in favor of the Democrats in the next, in the coming months? Is it the economy or is it geopolitics? Because there's Russia we talked about. Afghanistan was, I guess, the big shot. What do you see as the drivers underlying?
Voting registration, which is very
Yeah.
much also commented.
Yeah. So when you see, getting back to the last question, polls in terms of what are the big issues for voters, and election after election, top issue for voters, jobs and the economy. Jobs in the economy. How am I doing? What are my prospects? What are my prospects in terms of providing for my family and my prospects for advancement? So that will always be there. But I think COVID was one of the reasons why Terry McAuliffe, who had been governor of Virginia before, lost the race. Some of the things that he said while campaigning for governor about how he'd deal with COVID, I think ultimately did not put him in good stead among families in particular that were concerned about schools closing again entirely because of COVID and going back to remote learning. So COVID will play a part, but we'll have to wait and see. Things. I think that I'm actually glad I'm here. In DC right now, this variant it's just rampant. I think it's not as bad here. Not as bad here. DC, it's like I know so many people that have contracted COVID because of this new variant. So it really depends what happens I say that because it really depends what happens in the next few months, where we are with COVID. Hopefully we're in a better place than, I think we all hope that. It has nothing to do with politics. We all hope that. We're in a better place as we get closer to the midterm elections. And if that issue is taken off the table, then we return to the traditional issues that matter so much to voters, like jobs and the economy. But COVID, as things stand right now, is a major issue for people, major issue for voters. You see for some voters, not a large percentage, but the mandates for vaccinations are concerning. And, ultimately, this president, as my presentation hopefully showed you, has had declining poll numbers in part because of the way he has dealt with the pandemic. In part, there are other issues as well. The White House believes that once we turn the corner on COVID, it will also lead to improved approval ratings for President Biden. I don't know. That's their belief, and they may be right. But they were wrong when they said that the win by President Biden on the infrastructure bill would start to stem the decline and turn things around and give him momentum. They weren't right about that. And I was waiting to see if they were right. You can never tell these things, but they were not right about that. So to answer your question, just put a point on it, I think a lot depends about where we are in terms of the pandemic over the course of the next few months.
Any more questions?
Okay, Professor, can I have this question?
Yes.
Feel free to put your cameras on, huh? So we can see your face too. Don't be shy. Don't
Sorry, I mean, the house is not easy to do that, but I still thanks for your presentation. And the question is that there are two main factors influence the election result, and there might be two factors will be more and more important. The one is the racial composition of the voters, and another one is social media. How do you think of that? These two factors influence the future elections. Thank you.
Well, as it relates to racial composition, I think what you're getting to really is registration efforts, I think, that are being conducted by both political parties, getting out the vote. You know, we touched upon some of the things that impacted the 2020 election, one being COVID, but also happening in the summer was the summer of racial unrest in America. And that was not helpful in terms of President Trump's reelection. It did energize certain demographic groups in the US that helped President Biden. And the hope among Democrats is that that will lead to an increased number of new voters registered in the Democratic Party. So we'll have to see how successful that is. I know that the former First Lady, Michelle Obama, announced that she's leading a major registration effort on behalf of the Democratic Party, leading up ultimately to the 2024 election. And that's the way you win elections, more than anything. I think, you know, you register people, then you get those people that are registered out to vote. That's the way you win. You know, I'm struck really how the Republican Party has dealt with the loss in 2020. They dealt with it immediately in many states by passing what some would consider restrictive voter laws. And to me, that just misses the point. It misses the point of figuring out, okay, how do we get more of our people to vote for our people? How do we get more of our people to turn up and vote for our people? Because by just changing voter laws, you're just giving the rules to the road to everybody. Now the Democratic Party knows, okay, this is what we need to do. The rules have changed. This is what we need to do in 2022. This is what we need to do in 2024. And you know, if you're successful as a party, you meet those challenges. Whereas if you do what Michelle Obama, the former First Lady, is doing, trying to register people and then trying to get those people to go out and vote, I think that's a more effective way long-term to try to win elections, whether you're talking about midterms or the general election also. Yeah.
So there's some talk about Texas and Texas turning blue over time and getting really, really close. I really wanted to ask for the future of both them, like the Democratic Party and the Republican Party strategy. Texas is a crucial state, especially for Republicans. Wanted to ask you what you think is a probability that it will turn blue, and what do you think is a strategy going forward to try to fight over Texas?
Yeah, so we saw a little bit in terms of what people have predicted for Texas for many election cycles, which is that it's going to turn blue. It's going to elect a Democrat to the Senate. It's going to elect a Democrat to governor, and that hasn't happened. The Democrats have gotten close, but they haven't gotten close enough. In a few election cycles, the Democratic Party may be there where they're not just competing, but they're winning in those statewide elections. In a neighboring state, a little further out west, in Arizona, we've seen this change already play itself out. Who would have thought 20 years ago, the solid red state of Arizona would elect not one, but 2 Democrats to the US Senate? That's pretty remarkable. And the reason being is because of the changing nature of demographics in the state of Arizona, the increasing percentage of Hispanic voters. That has been the big difference. And so maybe what we see in Arizona will play itself out in an election cycle or 2 in Texas. I don't see that happening as early as 2024, but you know, things happen very quickly sometimes in politics. Yeah.
Any more questions for John?
Professor.
Yeah, one more.
Okay, and also about another factor is about social media. How do you think the social
Oh,
media?
that's right. You did ask me about that.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah,
social
thank
media.
you.
Yeah, I think that social media in the last two election cycles, presidential election cycles in 2016 and 2020, played an increasing role. In fact, we see how certain adversaries of the US, namely Russia, has tried to influence the US elections through nefarious efforts as it relates to social media in both of those elections. And I have no doubt that those bad actors will continue to try to do so in 2024. But, we being, Americans get our news from so many different sources now. It's not just what it used to be where you get your news of the day by watching the evening news at 6 or 6:30 or 7 o'clock. As why I mentioned, I teach at Georgetown University, and I always ask my students, where do they get their news? And maybe you ask the same question. Where do you get your news? And it's not from watching television. It's through social media feeds. That's where they're learning. That's where my students are getting familiar with what's happening in the news on a regular basis. And so as a result, I think that in a few years, I don't know how many, the network news that we see in the US at 6:30, ABC World News Tonight, and CBS Evening News, and NBC Nightly News, I think it's really going to be a thing of the past. And I'm not saying something that's real outlandish, because we see what the cable networks are doing. They're doing streaming now. Streaming, that's how people are going to get their programming, how they're going to get their news. And there's more of a focus on that. And so in the elections ahead and the years ahead, I think that the various campaigns will recognize that their money needs to be spent in different ways, perhaps, than the way they've spent them over the last few election cycles. It can't just be on 30-second spots on CNN or 30-second spots on local television. It needs to be spread out in other ways to get the message out, given the fact that people get their news in a variety of different ways. But it's a good question. Thank you.
And I think maybe a
Thank you.
last question from Josh.
Hey, Josh, I see you raising your hand.
Hi, Professor Decker. Thank you for your presentation and your comments. My question is regarding foreign policy and how President Biden might use foreign policy to secure greater support in the midterm elections. You mentioned how his sort of popular support started to go downhill after the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And you mentioned particularly recently regarding the Ukrainian crisis, how he has a lot on his plate and therefore is not being possibly as assertive as he should be. So regarding Taiwan and the region, how China is being more and more assertive in the region, might President Biden use that as an opportunity to fight back, and might that be a good strategy to help him gain more support for the midterm elections?
Well, I'll answer your question two ways, Josh, and it's a great question. I can talk to you about the way this administration will deal with the issue of Taiwan, but then I also want to talk about how that may impact or not impact an election. And they're two different things entirely. As it relates to Taiwan, I think that the US, as well as our allies around the world, need to act and will act, actually. This is the way that the Biden administration will likely approach it, collectively. The more economic threats that you can impose upon the Chinese government, and the way that you impose those economic threats is if you have not just the US market, but the European market collectively making threats. That's how you impact behavior, or potentially could impact behavior. And what the Chinese are doing with their ongoing threats against Taiwan, which they view as a breakaway province, are, I think, indicative of just sort of testing the resolve of the US and testing the resolve of the world community to see how they're going to react to these tests that they continue to impose on almost a regular basis. Now, the second part of my answer has to do with the impact on elections. And I must tell you, I don't think that this has any impact whatsoever on an election. As things stand right now, with the status quo, with just the threats that exist out there that China is imposing upon Taiwan and upon the region, by the way, not just Taiwan. Think about all the things that we've seen with the lack of freedoms now in Hong Kong. It doesn't resonate as things stand right now with most voters. Most voters, most, not all, most voters are focused on those pocketbook issues. But there are certainly voters that are impacted by this, voters that have interest in human rights, voters that have interest in the region and freedoms for the people of Hong Kong and democracy for Taiwan. I'm not diminishing their concerns in any way, but I'm talking overall at the status quo level, before you get beyond just the threats. I don't see any impact on an election whatsoever. But if you get beyond the threats where there's some sort of action taken by the Chinese, that's something entirely different. And that's where you have a president who is tested, and the president then the public, I should say, the electorate evaluates how that president has responded to those challenges. So I can't speak to a hypothetical that, something that may or may not happen on the part of the Chinese. But as things stand right now, with just the threats that the Chinese continue to make against Taiwan, with military exercises taking place, which seem to threaten Taiwan, that in and of itself, Josh, I don't see impacting a general election. But thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Anyone else from the audience? No? Okay. Well, I think that wraps it up.
Well,
Thank you so much, John.
Thank you, Waya. Thank you again to IE for having me back. I'm greatly honored by this. Hopefully the next time I'm here, we're not wearing masks. We can all be in a room together and not have to do this in a remote fashion. And obviously, thank you to AmChamSpain as well for putting this event together. I greatly appreciate it. And I hope it was illuminating for you to a certain extent as we get closer, 10 months away until the midterm election. So thank you for the people that came here today.
Who braved the elements.
Braved the elements, came here in person, and thank you for the people that are tuning in online. I greatly appreciate it.
And thank you. And let's, when you come back, we can parse out what you decided and what you predicted about Trump not running
Exactly.
in 2024.
I'm either going to look
Let's hope
brilliant
you're right.
guy, or I'm not going to look very smart at all. So yeah, we'll figure that out. Thank you again, everybody.
Thank you so much, John.
Thank you.